Welcome to Worthy of Work, the podcast created for all of us who secretly question what is normal in a relationship. My name is Stephanie Rivard, and here we cover the healthy relationship skills no one taught us. Today I want to talk about something that is deeply personal. And if this is a question you are struggling with, I just want you to know you are not alone. It's the question of, do I stay or do I go? Do I leave the marriage? This question used to plague me endlessly. It ran through my mind just like the constant hamster wheel. It never silenced. Sometimes I might hop off of the hamster wheel when there was a slight improvement in the conditions of the marriage or some grand gesture or words of promises. I would decide I could hop off the hamster wheel question for a while. But it wasn't long before I was back at the question, do I stay? Do I go? Today we're going to look at that question. I'm going to share with you my story, what I learned from it. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I will tell you the questions I asked myself and how I eventually had profound clarity about the answer to that question. Let's dive in. To add to maybe the complexity of this question, I had the element of faith, of Christian vows, that marriage is a covenant for life, in this sense that God does not agree with divorce. And so that was this kind of the base, the foundation where this question was being explored, which certainly adds to the complexity of answering that question. But I looked at the question constantly. When I was in a toxic, unhealthy marriage, I endlessly would ask myself that question, do I stay, do I go? We had children, and the answer to that question would not only affect me and obviously my partner, but children. Am I prepared to divide homes? So our child would experience divided homes. This is a major question. Clearly, if you're listening to this, if this is not relevant to you, you're not listening to this episode. You're listening to this if you share the agony of this question. For me, I asked myself this question for years, while enduring, shall we call it, dysfunctional marital relationship. It was not on the small scale of the dysfunction. I don't share the explicits on any platform like this, but we are in the major leagues of problems, meaning lies, deceit, emotional abuse, promises of change, and this pattern, and again, this kind of religious pressure to stay and to make it work. And I did. I wanted it to work. When I made those vows, I meant them. I did not want to be a divorced person. In fact, I was ashamed to think of holding that title. Asking myself that question for years, I learned to focus on a few things and ask myself these things. Maybe it'll help you. Eventually I started looking at behaviors. Prior to that, I was really focused on words, what was being said, the promises, the hope, the shared values, but not the actions that align with those values. And so I learned to focus my attention on the behavior. This was very hard because I could coach or encourage or maybe just even he would be inspired himself to say words I wanted to hear. But lasting behavioral changes that aligned with those values rarely occurred. And again, lasting. So I would ask myself, what am I seeing? What are the behaviors that I'm seeing? And what future does that indicate? If I were to take these actions that are real right now and play that story out, play that movie forward, what is the rest of that movie? Not where do I hope it'll go, but based off of this, where does this story go? And it often showed me, oh, I know where this goes. It goes back in this loop. I've been in that before. I know where it goes. It goes back in this loop, and back in this loop, and back in this loop. And would I like to live in that loop again? And the answer was no. I learned that people can change, actually. They can change if they want to change as badly as they want to breathe. Then they can change. What does this mean? This means finding the resources, the support, the accountability, the skills necessary to change. This could look like therapy, 12-step groups, accountability partners, and arranging these resources at any cost. You're traveling for work? Book it there. Book a virtual counseling appointment. Attend a 12-step meeting in another city. They're everywhere. Find the resources that are necessary for change. And if someone's showing that level of commitment to change, that's interesting. That would have my attention. But paying lip service to a desired goal with moderate to no action towards it is a red flag. It does not work. I'm going to be really assertive on that. Moderate, lame, I will improve my response only after a fight for a couple days, will produce the same results on repeat. Are you willing to live like that? Eventually, my answer was no. I asked myself, do I feel safe here? Physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually? Am I safe here? It's a good question. If I share vulnerably, is it cherished and protected? Or is it defensiveness? Is it used as a target for the next argument or attack? That is not a safe environment. Another very powerful question I asked is, would I want my daughter to repeat this pattern? And the answer was a resounding no. And how could I expect her to achieve anything else in her future marriage if I gave her an example of it that was not worth repeating? In fact, if repeated, would just be dysfunction on dysfunction. What kind of example was I giving my daughter to say, this is how a woman should be treated? This is what a marriage is like. This is how a husband treats his wife. What example was I endorsing? What kind of dynamic was I putting my Stephanie approves of this stamp on? And this really challenged, I think, a lot of my faith and ideas around, again, this marital covenant of marriage. And they started competing. Well, I want my daughter to know that marriage is a commitment for life. Yes, I do want that. But will I prioritize that even if the example of the marriage is one of utter dysfunction? Because that's a risky example to demonstrate. Have I let no stone go unturned. Meaning, have I done everything I think I can do to try to reconcile, to try to repair, to try to create a healthy marriage? Have I done the counseling? Individual counseling, yes, marital counseling, that's a smart idea. But if the individuals aren't very well, then the marital counseling isn't going to be very fruitful either. So, will I attend? Did I commit to my own counseling? Yes. Did we try couples counseling? Yes. Was I serious about my own recovery, my own health and healing and growth? Was I, working the steps, calling a mentor, being involved in my growth? Did I take that seriously? Was I learning about myself and learning about the character defects that I had that weren't helping? They weren't helping the situation. In fact, an analogy I've often used, it's like maybe he started a fire in the living room. Okay? He starts this fire, this problem in our home. And then I went and threw a bunch of wood on it. I toss the kitchen table on and I throw the chairs on top of it. And then I look and I say, well, look at the fire you started. Look at what you caused. Well, in that analogy, we could see well, he started the little fire and I made it a big fire. So in using that analogy, what was my contribution to the problem? How was I making this a bigger problem? Was it in my response? Was it in my silence? Was I expecting mind reading? Was I belittling? Was I not asking for what I need in a clean, healthy, clear way? Did I explore all of that? And then again, did I leave no stone unturned? Did I exhaust what I think is reasonable to repair the marriage? And was I seeing that kind of diligence and effort on his part? If so, maybe there was a chance. Two dedicated people restoring something that requires two people. But it wouldn't be a solution made by one person's effort and another person's words. It was also helpful for me to get that outside perspective and support. Living in something that is really dysfunctional, not working, probably one of the strongest byproducts of that is self-doubt. Questioning, am I being reasonable? Is this healthy? Is this normal? Am I asking too much? Am I asking too little? And it was very valuable to me to get an outside perspective, another set of clean, unbiased, not unemotional person saying, yes, that's reasonable. That is not healthy. You can't tolerate that. That's a fair boundary. Follow through on that and just reinforcing it, because this self-doubt plagued me. And I didn't know if my reactions could be trusted. So it really helped me to get a healthy person. So not just any girlfriend will do here to, cheer you on. You need to get someone who has a clear, sound mind. That could be a professional or just someone with a really healthy skill set to weigh in on this and give you unbiased response. If they're just going to approve and agree with whatever you say, please don't go to them. That won't be the feedback you really need to hear. Someone who will tell you if you're being unreasonable, and someone who will tell you the hard truth if what is happening in your home is abusive. Someone has to be really kind and clear with you. This whole process pointed to another problem inside of me, was a problem of my identity. And I was really uncomfortable with the idea that part of my identity would be a divorcee. That I would, have this kind of scarlet letter. I'd wear this label that I dreaded to have, particularly again inside of a faithful community, that to be a divorcee would be an attack on my self-worth, which is false. I eventually recognized that as a lie. That I'm not a failure because the marriage it didn't work. I am not a failure if my marriage didn't work. You are not a failure if your marriage didn't work. In fact, you know what is absolutely mind-blowing? And this might make me cry. A few months ago, I was doing some journaling for a course I was working on, and one of the questions was, what am I most proud of? And do you know what was the first thing I wrote down? My divorce. Yeah. How can that be? I thought I would be ashamed of that. I thought it would be this thing I have to hide and cower from or explain. But I saw it so differently now because it was a sign, that event, that decision to leave a dysfunctional relationship is now not this scarlet letter and something to be ashamed of. I could recognize that that is tremendous courage. It is a huge sign of health to not tolerate dysfunction. That most people actually leave, or if they do go, they leave in such an explosive way that they do more damage instead of what I strive to do, and imperfectly, but to leave with mine and his dignity intact. So my identity wasn't going to be defined by a moment in my journey, by an experience that I endured. My identity wouldn't be attached to that. And I encourage you to consider the same for you. Your identity is not something you have experienced. That something that was part of your story is not your identity, and it does not define your worth. So what was it like? What happened? Hey, do you want to know the story? Well, I mentioned that I had asked this question for years as we were going through processes and therapy and working to make it work. And then one evening, I could remember it like it was yesterday. I was sitting on our dark green velvet couch, no kidding, and he had shared some information with me that typically would have been devastating. And instead of being hit by the wave of pain, instead I was overcome by a wave of peace. It was a spiritual experience, and I can't describe it as anything else. And I knew in that moment that I was free to leave, that it was time to go. And again, instead of this agony that would have been very appropriate for the situation, instead of that, I almost felt giddy. I was elated. I was overcome by this sense of clarity. I remember going to the basement bedroom and calling a mentor who had been through this journey with me. And I said, "You will not believe what just happened." I said, I'm free to go. God has been clear with me. I have peace in my decision. The answer was there. What I had agonized over for years prior to that now was perfectly clear. And she said, "Okay, what are the next steps?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to have to tell him that I will need a job, I need a home, and I need childcare." She said, "Okay, let's make a plan." And all of a sudden, the question that I was stumped by was the question that I had clarity to. That might be annoying to hear. All of a sudden you just knew, Steph. Well, that was my story. All of a sudden I knew. All of a sudden I had clarity. And it doesn't deny the value in the other questions and the processing that I had to do to get me there. I don't think, even if God had been so clear with me and I hadn't looked at questions of my self-worth or these fears of, one I hadn't even mentioned, what would other people think? Man, was that a defect of character of mine. I was afraid to do what I needed to do because I was afraid of people's thoughts of me, their opinions. Well, I was hitched to that. I was constrained by that, and I needed to free myself of that fear, that thinking, that character defect, so that I could become free enough to be moved by the Holy Spirit, that I could receive that clarity, that when the situation presented itself, that I could be of sober mind, that I wasn't burdened by the character defects that had currently, up until that point, been really at play. What was my motive? Imagine that. My motive was, at one time, was to stay in the marriage so I could keep up, images, my image in the social setting, at church. Wow, Steph, that's a lousy motive. That's not a virtuous motive, even though I probably would have liked to camouflage that into commitment and sacrificial marriage and blah, blah, blah. But deep down, it was image management. Yikes. And I needed to get free of those things so that clarity could come. I needed to do the work so that I was in a position to receive the answer. I had to understand that love didn't have to hurt and suffer to be real. I had to challenge these ideas, and I did a podcast on this before about marriage is hard and it takes work, and I needed to face that and understand that and question that and realize, wait a second, dysfunction is not what they mean here. Hard means mutually striving towards something in a healthy way, not endure dysfunction and call it virtue. I remember asking myself a question, when I spotted all those character defects, people-pleasing, image management, fear, shame, identity. And I asked myself, what would I do if I wasn't afraid? If I wasn't afraid of all of those things? Inside of me, the answer was there long before the clarity came. I needed to clear out the clutter so I could see it, hear it, experience that peace in the answer. And then tap into the courage to do it. It took courage. It took tremendous courage. And that's why I can answer that question, as I mentioned, about what's something I'm proud of. And I know, there are some Christians listening to this that think that is a very bad statement. How could someone be proud of their divorce? Answer that question once you've left an abusive relationship. And tell me how much virtue and faith that took. And what you've offered your children by leading as an example to what God really designed marriage to be, which was beautiful and good, not just enduring abuse and tolerating that dysfunction in the name of virtue. Should you stay or should you go? If you're asking yourself that question today, I encourage you to sneak off somewhere quiet, find peace, cry. It's okay. Free yourself from the idea that if my marriage fails, then I'm a failure. That's not true. Ask yourself, are you seeing real evidence in consistent behavior indicating that there is something to stay for? other than more of the repeated problem. Get real with yourself. Look at it honestly. It will be hard to do that, but it'll be critical that you make a decision out of truth, not out of fantasy, where we're hoping we'll become, not out of fiction where we deny and minimize the problem, where we explain it away because people have a backstory, they have problems, and therefore we're going to excuse bad behavior. No, we can't do that anymore. Challenge the idea that your worth is attached to your enduring sacrifice in dysfunction. And clarity will come. It'll come slowly over time. And it might come in a big, clear movement like that. But again, for me, I think it had been there for a long time, but I finally had the inner peace and tidied that up enough to hear the answer. And when you're ready to answer that, and if the answer is to go, I pray you will go in peace and integrity, not in anger and spite and resentfulness. Go take action and keep your dignity intact. And I pray that the peace of the Lord be upon you.
That's it for today's episode. If this resonates with you, please subscribe, share, or leave a review. It helps more people find this work. And remember, I'm not a therapist. I'm just someone who once thought dysfunction was pretty normal. I wanted better and learned new tools. And so can you.